Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing study of 1968. In the previous lectures, we've talked about the 1950s, the age of Eisenhower and diplomacy in foreign relations, and then the age of affluence on the American home front. In this lecture, we'll continue our discussion of the 1950s, but peering a little bit more deeply into the cracks in American society and popular culture, and in particular, the rise of a counterculture in the 50s that in some ways is going to anticipate the growing counterculture of the 60s and, of course, what we will see in full measure in 1968. The generation of children born in the aftermath of World War II holds a special place in our country and its history, and has a special name. They were known as the baby boomers. The stability of families, the lower age of marrying couples, and, in some cases, the happiness of couples reuniting after the war ended, led to a bumper crop of kids born between 1948 and 1953. This generation of children has brought changes with them at every stage in their development through life. Some say, if you were investing in stocks, you could have made your retirement alone by tracing the baby boomers and industries in which that generation was involved. In the 1950s and early 60s, we see a boom in education as schools are revamped to handle the huge classes. Also a boom in sales of toys and childhood goods, children's clothing, diapers, and family-sized packaging of all sorts and varieties. In the mid to late 60s, as this generation grows towards adulthood, college ranks swell, and with them the ranks of protesters. And in fact, in our study of 1968, it is, of course, college campuses and college students of this generation that are going to become extremely important, and we'll be talking more about this throughout this lecture. Later, in the 1970s and 80s, as the baby boomers reach working age, they have to compete for jobs, and the economy struggled. And of course, now in our current society, the baby boomers are well into retirement in most cases, and we as a nation confront challenges involving Social Security, paying for their retirement, and so on, and also challenges in the healthcare system. As we talk about the 1950s, we're generally talking about the parents of the baby boomers. And in general, we see a return to the traditional gender roles that were transformed somewhat during World War II. There were many women who were eager to return to the home and motherhood after finding new roles during World War II in the workforce, the famous Rosie the Riveter campaign, and so on. The baby boom contributed to motherhood as a primary and crucial occupation for women. And of course, there are many exceptions to this, and we'll talk about some of those as we go along. But in this age of conformity, which I talked about previously, women staying home and raising the children was the way to conform. One element of this was one of the best-selling books of this entire era, published in 1946 and republished many, many times, written by Dr. Benjamin Spock, The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, which emphasized that the appropriate role for women was staying home and raising children, rather than being out in the workplace and putting stresses on the process of raising kids. This theme was emphasized throughout American culture. I mentioned some of the television shows that were popular last time, and in 1956, Life magazine wrote, "Of all the accomplishments of the American woman, the one she brings off with the most spectacular success is having babies." Parents of the baby boomers confronted numerous concerns, which again reinforced their emphasis on conformity and the support of American values. They were worried about nuclear weapons, and in some cases about the annihilation of the world. They were worried about concerns in the home and relationships, and the growing prominence of divorce. They were, of course, extremely concerned about their kids and what kind of activities they were up to out there in the schools and in the streets. And in general, they sought to reinforce American values, again, contributing to this era of conformity and consensus. At the same time, there is a newfound growing youth culture, which in some cases fit in with that culture of conformity, and in others pushed the boundaries and rebelled against them. When we get to 1968, and we're going to talk about the college students and teenagers of that era and the ways that they pushed back. Well, a half generation earlier, in the 1950s, there were teenagers and college kids in the 50s who were pushing back against the culture imposed upon them by their parents and teachers and other adults in their lives. And so we start to see a growing counterculture, even in the 1950s. While much of the culture in the 1950s emphasized conformity and supporting American values, as I mentioned previously, movie makers in the 50s also attempted to counteract the popularity of television by creating films that could never be seen on television. They emphasized edgy themes and sexual situations in some cases, themes of youth rejecting materialism. We also see the sexuality of Marilyn Monroe pushing the boundaries of proper behavior. In general, the youth of the 50s found less guidance and attention from their parents, and sought such comfort and guidance with each other, in clubs and cliques, and in some cases in gangs. They drank, they smoked, and experimented sexually. Ironically, the youth also became a key demographic within the consumer society, buying clothing, jewelry, records, soft drinks, cigarettes, and even cars at times. There were also mixed messages in Cold War popular culture. Not all examples are so clear-cut on one side of the cultural mainstream or the other. Many Hollywood productions included mixed messages, like Marlon Brando's The Wild One, as one example. It was about a motorcycle gang that tore through a small town, filled with troubled youth. Marlon Brando was the gang's leader. In one famous sequence, a young woman asks him, "What are you rebelling against?" And he replies, "Well, what you got?" Still, the conclusions of the story send a mixed message. Brando's character longs for the companionship of a waitress named Kathy, who represents all that is good in the world. In the end, though, Brando rides out of town without Kathy, and order is restored in the community. Similarly, in James Dean's signature role in Rebel Without a Cause of 1955, Dean was an alienated high schooler named Jim Stark. In posters and advertisements, he appears to be the ultimate symbol of teen angst and rebellion. But the movie's message was hardly radical. The film supported tight-knit, supportive families and helped those in need. By the end of the movie, Jim no longer has any reason to protest. Nonetheless, images of rebellion remained popular in 1950s films. Some of the popular figures included Robin Hood and Davy Crockett, both of whom operated at the fringes of the law. And popular Western films incorporated many of these same elements. Some turned to performance as a way of questioning authority by way of allegory. Science fiction films often represented some parallel in society, but as Rod Serling, who created The Twilight Zone in 1959, said, "Things that couldn't be said by a Republican or a Democrat could be said by a Martian." There were many Cold War allegories in science fiction films, and these were immensely popular throughout the 1950s. Them was about giant, irradiated ants who terrorized the Earth. The Incredible Shrinking Man was about a man who shrunk after being exposed to radiation. And On the Beach in 1959 was essentially about the end of the world after nuclear war. Some of these films celebrated unity among mankind to overcome aliens that threaten all of us. Others warn of the irrationality and danger of a world dominated by atomic bombs. And finally, there are many films in the 50s that centered on the darkness lurking within society. Alfred Hitchcock was perhaps the ultimate filmmaker in this vein. In his films, so-called normal people of the world masked horror lurking underneath. Normal people commit heinous acts and crimes. And this seemed to suggest that the age of conformity and consensus on the surface harbored many doubts beneath the surface. This rebellion against the conformist 1950s society had many expressions across all sorts of culture. The abstract art of artists like Jackson Pollock, who dripped and spotted paint on a canvas and created abstract models like the one you see pictured to the right. The poetry of beat poets such as Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and others, poets from Greenwich Village, New York, or San Francisco, favored spontaneity and freedom over the conformist lifestyles of mainstream Americans. These presaged the hippies of the 1960s. Ginsberg, in one of his poems, argued against robot apartments, invisible suburbs, skeleton treasuries, blind capitals, demonic industries, and monstrous bombs. In jazz music, many musicians rejected the neat 1950s that were seen on television. Miles Davis and Dizzy Gillespie and others experimented with new rhythms, tones, and styles. And controversial comedians, such as Lenny Bruce and Dick Gregory, challenged traditionally acceptable language and content for their bits. In this kind of rebellion, we see cracks in the veneer of the prosperous and peaceful 1950s. All was not happy in 1950s America. Discontent percolated beneath the surface, and in other cases, rose to the surface. But no element of the 1950s counterculture terrified parents so much as rock and roll music. In the 1940s and 50s, the popular musical styles featured smooth-voiced crooners, Bing Crosby, Perry Como, Dean Martin, and others. Even in the 1940s, though, there were hundreds of smaller labels that pushed alternative artists. These independent companies, who pressed only a few hundred records at a time, were able to push the boundaries of what was acceptable, churning out records that might be considered loud, racy, or morally questionable. Radio also played an important role in the rise of rock and roll. With the advent of television, many radio executives turned to specialized segmented audiences. Rather than continuing to appeal to families sitting around the radio for hours on end, they turned to playing records of only a few minutes in length. Disc jockeys were important also. Many of them came to be considered the focal point of the radio station, and some of them became powerful enough to play different types of music. Some turned to playing so-called black music in the early 1950s, most notably Alan Freed, pictured on the right, on Cleveland's WJW radio station, began playing R&B records given to him by a local record store owner. Soon white teenagers were calling the show, making requests. DJs around the country soon began to realize that whites would listen to this kind of music as well. This was all part of a growing teenage subculture. Neighborhood recreation centers where teens could hang out, listen to music, dance, play games, and so on were on the rise. Teenagers also, as I mentioned, became an important demographic. 17 magazine, even as early as 1945, had more than 1 million subscribers and was becoming a force in advertising. Businessmen were targeting teens as consumers. Most often, kids listened to what they wanted to listen to. They spurned the advice and influence of adults and were drawn to rock and roll. Many of the songs focused on being young and the challenges of growing up. They focused on romance and sex. Rock and roll echoed the sexual innuendo of R&B. In fact, rock was a synonym for sex. Critics of rock and roll questioned its sexual suggestion as well as its origins in black music. But most white performers admired black musicians and did aspire to be more like them. As one white musician said about visiting the black section of Memphis, "I drove down Beale Street in the middle of the night. I was flabbergasted. It was rockin'. It was so active, musically, socially. God, I loved it." Rock and roll became the music of integration. Chuck Berry, a leading black performer, performed to audiences that were thoroughly integrated, and both white and black audiences loved it. Black artists also listened to white music. Ray Charles performed for a time with an all-white country band as backup. Many rock and roll singers came from racially and socially outcast groups. They were raised poor, had few other options, but they had a ready audience in other people like themselves, and teenage kids were drawn to them. The culmination of all of these trends in rock and roll was Elvis Presley, without question the biggest star of his era and continuing one of the biggest stars of all time. He became rock and roll's biggest selling artist and accounted for 10% of all music sales in 1956 just by himself. That year, he had 5 of the top 9 songs of the year and sold 75 albums a day. Don't Be Cruel was number 1 for 11 weeks. Presley was young, southern, and poor, like many other aspiring rock artists. He was born in 1935 in Tupelo, Mississippi, as so-called white trash. At the age of 13, he moved to Memphis, his family simply looking for some kind of opportunity. He got his start at Sun Records, a small independent studio in Memphis owned by Sam Phillips. Phillips welcomed aspiring singers and uneducated singers. It was a pioneer disc jockey named Dewey Phillips at the Memphis station WHBQ who first played Elvis on the radio and dubbed him a hit. That's All Right was his first hit. Phillips played the song 7 times in a row and gave Elvis his first radio interview. Elvis was also influenced by race. He paid respect to black musicians and acknowledged his debt to them. In 1956, he said, "The colored folks have been singing it and playing it just like I'm doing now, man, for more years than I know. And nobody paid them no mind till I goosed it up. I got it from them." Elvis also reflected the importance of young people to rock and roll. He had always been something of a rebel. He wore his hair slicked in a wave with long sideburns. The responsiveness of young audiences led him to increasingly risky sexual grounds. On the one hand, he toyed with his own gender. He often wore pink when on stage. His hair was long. He often wore makeup. He helped to create an androgynous side of rock music that influenced other artists like Mick Jagger, David Bowie, and countless others, many of whom were very influential in 1968. He also began bumping and grinding his hips on stage. His drummer actually rehearsed by playing for burlesque shows, in which the drummer hits an accent when the performer thrusts his hips. He did the same with Elvis. This sexuality stirred feelings with his audiences, especially teenage girls, and you see this in the picture on the screen. Good church-going and school-going girls still contemplated their sexual freedom. They went to black juke joints and admired the dancing. They went out on the weekends and experimented. And at his concerts, young women behaved as if they had been sexually unleashed. It was not uncommon for them to fall on the floor, panting and heaving. Elvis inspired much controversy in the mainstream press. He was considered distasteful at least, dangerous and sinful at worst. There were record smashings, picketings, and in some towns his performances were banned. Elvis is the forebearer of the importance of rock and roll, which we'll talk so much about in the 1960s and 1968. He himself returns in 1968 to newfound prominence with a televised live performance, which we'll talk about later on in the course. For now, in our next lecture, we continue exploring the background of 1968, pushing forward into the 1960s.